Hey there. Tonight we follow a question that should never have an answer. What if gravity suddenly shifted? The ground beneath me was steady as always, the familiar weight of my body pressing into the earth, and yet I could not shake the thought that this invisible force we take for granted is not as immutable as we believe. The idea had crept into my mind during a long night of silence, when every shadow seemed heavier, and even my own breath carried a strange, restless pull. It was then that I remembered the old records, forgotten papers tucked away in archives, whispers of an event so peculiar that most dismissed it as myth. They called it the Day of the Falling Sky. I had first stumbled across the phrase in a brittle journal from the late 19th century. The handwriting was careful, measured, belonging to someone who wanted posterity to understand. He described people walking in fields when suddenly the world itself seemed to stutter, as though gravity had grown uncertain of its role. Stones lifted from the soil, then fell again. Water curved against its riverbanks before splashing downward in violent sprays. Birds collapsed mid-flight, unable to adjust. For 23 minutes, the writer claimed, gravity was no longer the steady hand guiding existence. It became a trembling thread, fraying, tightening, then slackening again. If such a moment occurred, how could it not be recorded more widely? Why was there not an international uproar, scientific revolutions, political upheavals? The journal had no answers, only fragmented details. A cracked church bell that rang without being struck, a child who claimed the ground pushed her into the sky, and animals refusing to move as though the earth itself frightened them. Perhaps these were metaphors, I told myself, until I found the corroborating accounts, not many but enough to weigh on the mind. A village newspaper from 1887, never digitised, told of farmers who awoke to find their wells empty because the water had briefly climbed the stone shafts before rushing back down. A sailor's letter described the ocean's surface heaving unnaturally, like the breath of a giant sleeping beneath. I wanted to dismiss it all, but the more I read, the more consistent the details became. No one spoke of earthquakes, no one mentioned storms or winds. They spoke of weight itself behaving like a fickle spirit, appearing and vanishing, leaving panic in its wake. The unsettling part was not only that these documents existed, but that they seemed deliberately forgotten, as if they had been excised from our collective memory. So I began to ask myself, what would it mean if gravity truly shifted, even for a brief time? Imagine the terror of holding a glass and watching it hover an inch above your palm before crashing down. Imagine the air thick with dust and feathers that refuse to settle. Imagine, for just one unbearable moment, the betrayal of the one force we rely on without question. Gravity is more than physics. It is trust, continuity, the comfort that no matter what else fails, the ground will catch us. If that falters, everything else falters with it. And yet the thought carried a strange allure. What if gravity is not permanent but alive, a force with moods or cycles older than the earth itself? Ancient myths often speak of days when the world tilted, when people floated into the sky or sank into the ground. We assume these were allegories. But what if they were memories, diluted across generations? Could civilizations have risen and fallen under conditions of unstable gravity, leaving only confused legends behind? I could not let go of the image. A single day when the air grew light, when bodies stumbled as though drunk, when rivers fought their own beds, when the horizon seemed wrong. If this had happened once, could it happen again? Would we recognize the warning signs, or would the shift come silently, tearing certainty away in an instant? That night, as I closed the last journal and the silence of my room pressed close, I swore the air itself felt heavier, as if the earth was reminding me of its hold, and I wondered, what if it loosened that hold tomorrow? The thought clung to me like a fever. refusing to leave even as morning light poured through the window. It was absurd, wasn't it? Gravity does not change, cannot change, or so we have been told all our lives. Yet the words of those forgotten journals weighed heavily in my mind, and when I stepped outside into the pale light, I found myself testing the solidity of the ground with every step. I pressed my heel into the soil as if daring it to let me go. The earth, as always, obliged, but there was a hesitation in me now, a suspicion that the invisible force binding us to the world could waver again. I began to search further, not in the tidy indexes of libraries, but in the brittle silence of neglected archives where stories linger too strange to be catalogued. In a dimly lit storeroom, I came across another account, this one far older, scratched into vellum by a monk in the 14th century. He spoke of a Sabbath when the air turned treacherous, when chalices rose from the altar as though grasped by unseen hands, and men clung to doorways in terror. He wrote that after an hour it passed, but the memory lingered, filling the monastery with whispers that the world had tilted on its axis. Was this only metaphor, or had he witnessed the same tremor in the laws of nature that those villagers centuries later described? The trail deepened further when I traced folklore. Legends of light days appeared across continents, scattered in oral traditions that never touched one another. In a remote Siberian tale, hunters spoke of a night when deer floated above the snow and were pulled back down only after blood was spilled in sacrifice. An African story spoke of the day the ground sighed, when children were lifted and set down again as if by invisible arms. Always brief, always terrifying, always forgotten. What unsettled me most was how these accounts hid in plain sight, dismissed as exaggeration, superstition, or poetic symbol. But what if they weren't? What if scattered across time were fractured records of the same phenomenon, rare but real? I began to notice something strange. The descriptions often included silence. Birds stopped singing. Wind ceased to stir. Even insects seemed to fall quiet, as though the entire world paused to feel the shift. Why would so many unrelated accounts share that one eerie detail? Silence is not easily remembered, yet it appeared again and again, like an echo rippling through centuries. And then I found the report that unsettled me most, dated 1943, written by a soldier stationed on a remote island during the war. He described a night patrol where the sand beneath his boots seemed to lighten, and his body, weighed down with gear, lifted just enough that he stumbled forward. He claimed others experienced the same, though none spoke of it aloud, afraid it would be dismissed as exhaustion. The silence afterward was so complete that even the sea seemed to stop. A few minutes later everything returned, but he wrote, "I knew then the earth could betray me." It was that word that struck me. Betray. To think of gravity as capable of betrayal was to acknowledge that we expect loyalty from it, as though it were a guardian, not a law. And if it's capable of betrayal once, then why not again? I felt unease curling in me, not just as a historian piecing fragments together, but as a human being suddenly aware of how fragile our existence might be. What is civilization if not a fragile arrangement balanced on a constant force? If that constant slips, everything else unravels. Would towers collapse? Would oceans leap from their beds? Would our bodies, so carefully evolved for one level of pull, shatter under a sudden change? That night I dreamed of walking through my town while everything began to rise. Leaves, stones, droplets of water hanging in mid-air. People clutched at fences, screaming, but their voices never reached me because the silence was absolute. And then the force returned, and everything crashed down at once in a violence beyond comprehension. I woke gasping, unsure whether it had been a dream or memory inherited from some deeper past. I knew then that I could no longer ignore the question. If gravity had shifted before, could it happen again in my lifetime? That question was no longer a phantom curiosity, but a living thing gnawing at my waking hours. I found myself scanning the horizon for signs that no one else bothered to look for. The way a tree leaned, the way birds traced their arcs, the way my own footsteps pressed into the soil. I was no longer certain that the world beneath me was stable. Every small tremor of doubt stretched into something larger, until daily life began to feel like a fragile performance rehearsed under the shadow of collapse. I tried to rationalize. Physics insists that gravity is immutable, a constant woven into the fabric of space-time. Einstein taught us that it bends with mass, curves with stars, and yet its presence remains. Could all those journals, those legends, those scattered testimonies, simply be misunderstandings of other phenomena? Magnetic storms, earthquakes, hallucinations born of fatigue or hunger? That would be the logical conclusion. But then why did so many accounts echo the same imagery? Objects trembling in mid-air, silence pressing down like a blanket, bodies stumbling as though the air itself betrayed them. Misunderstandings are never that consistent. The more I searched, the more the fragments aligned. I discovered that some scientists in the early 20th century, on the margins of their respected peers, had quietly speculated about gravitational anomalies. Most of their work was ignored, filed away. But in their letters, I saw the same fear, that gravity was not as fixed as we wish to believe. One wrote, "If the pull is a woven thread, then threads can fray." Perhaps only once in many centuries, but enough to remind us that certainty is an illusion. That sentence haunted me. Certainty is an illusion. We build our lives, our cities, our empires, on the assumption that gravity is eternal. But what if it isn't? What if we are passengers on a ship whose anchor sometimes drags, sometimes lifts, threatening to cast us adrift without warning? The psychological weight of that realization bore down on me harder than any scientific curiosity. At night, I found myself lying awake, waiting for the sensation of my body loosening against the mattress, for the first hint that the invisible tether was faltering. I wondered what would happen if it did, just for a few minutes. Would the world recover quietly, as in those accounts, or would chaos ripple out uncontrollably? And I began to fear that our minds would collapse even faster than our structures. What happens to human trust when the one constant of existence betrays us? We trust gravity with every breath, every step, every gesture of the hand. If it shifts, even briefly, then no wall, no floor, no promise of safety would ever feel the same again. Could society withstand such a blow, or would we fracture into panic and myth, clinging to desperate explanations? It was during this spiral of thought that I uncovered something stranger still. An astronomer's private notes from 1921 described nights when stars seemed displaced, as though the heavens themselves wavered. His instruments recorded slight irregularities, so faint they were dismissed as mechanical error. But he wrote privately that he felt the weight of his body shift on those nights, lighter one moment, heavier the next. He feared ridicule, so he never published. Yet here it was again, another echo. Could it be that these moments were not isolated incidents, but part of a cycle? Something buried deep in the rhythms of the cosmos? The thought terrified me, but it also compelled me forward. If there was a cycle, then another shift was inevitable. And what if that shift was stronger, longer, less forgiving? I knew then that I could no longer remain a passive reader of history's scattered pages. I had to seek the places where these anomalies were strongest, where legends and reports clustered like bruises on the fabric of time. For if gravity had trembled before, I needed to know where the tremors had begun. That single conviction became my compass, dragging me from quiet archives into landscapes that still whispered of strange days. If records were scattered across centuries, then surely the earth itself bore scars where its pull had faltered. I traced old maps, marking places where testimonies clustered, where folklore grew dense with stories of light bodies and falling skies. Soon, one region emerged like a shadow under moonlight, a valley in the Carpathian Mountains where shepherds had long spoken of air that misbehaves. The journey there was as much psychological as physical. Each mile deeper into the mountains, I carried the weight of expectation, yet also a gnawing fear. What if the ground beneath me betrayed its hold while I stood there? What if the valley still breathed with the weakness of gravity, and I would feel it firsthand? Such thoughts curled tighter around me as the path narrowed into steep trails, the silence of the forest pressing in. Locals in the villages skirted the topic. When I asked directly, they smiled uneasily, claiming ignorance. But in the flicker of their eyes I saw recognition, the quick glance exchange between people who share a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. One elderly man, his voice roughened by years of mountain wind, muttered only this: "In that valley, stones do not remember the ground." He would not say more. I entered the valley at dusk. The air was unnervingly still, as though even the wind avoided the place. Grass bent in directions that did not match the slope, leaning oddly, as though tugged by something invisible. I stopped a flat clearing where the ground was littered with stones of unusual roundness, as if worn not by water, but by a different kind of pressure, or lack of it. As I stood there, I felt a faint shiver inside my chest. Not fear exactly, but a shift, as though the weight of my heart had lightened for a beat. I told myself it was imagination, but deep inside I knew it was not. That night I camped on the valley floor. Sleep did not come easily. The silence here was different, deeper, like the pause in a story before something crucial is revealed. As hours stretched on, I noticed how small sounds carried strangely. A pebble I dropped seemed to take longer to strike the ground, as if reluctant to end its fall. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, enough to make me hold my breath. And then came the moment that erased doubt. Just before dawn, as the sky shifted from black to grey, I watched mist rising from the grass. But it did not rise. It hovered, as though suspended in invisible hands. Wisps curled upward and then froze, lingering mid-air for seconds that stretched too long. My skin prickled. I reached out, and the vapour recoiled slightly before descending again in a rush, scattering like smoke caught in sudden wind. What had I seen? A trick of temperature, or the faintest echo of gravity faltering? The weight of that possibility pressed on me more heavily than fear, because if it could happen here, now, even for a heartbeat, then the accounts I had read were not myths, they were warnings. At sunrise I walked deeper, following the stream that cut through the valley. The water behaved strangely too. It pooled thickly at bends, resisting its own current as though something slowed its descent. When it did break free, it surged forward violently, crashing against rocks with disproportionate force. Watching it, I felt the unnerving sense that the world here was in negotiation with itself, unable to decide what rules applied. I left the valley shaken, but I knew I would return. This was no ordinary place, and it was not finished with me. The tremors had begun here once, and I suspected they would begin again. That conviction weighed on me as I left the Carpathian Valley. Though I carried no proof in my hands, only impressions carved deep into my senses. Still, the memory of the mist freezing mid-air was enough to unsettle every rational defence I tried to construct. It was not just folklore anymore. I had seen with my own eyes something that should not exist. That glimpse lingered like a bruise, demanding to be pressed, prodded, understood. Back in the nearest village, I sought out the old man who had spoken of stones forgetting the ground. At first he refused to see me, muttering through the closed door that outsiders never left such places unchanged. But when I insisted, he finally stepped out. his eyes clouded not with age but with the weight of memory. He told me a story he had sworn never to share. When he was a child, he had wandered too close to the valley and watched his father's lantern drift upward from the ground, tugging against the man's grip until the flame itself bent sideways. His father yanked it down, terrified, and warned him never to return. "That place," the man whispered, "reminds the earth that it does not own us." I felt the chill of recognition. His description mirrored what I had seen, and yet it carried an even deeper warning. If such incidents continued across generations, then the valley was more than a relic of the past. It was active, alive, perhaps waiting. But waiting for what? My research pulled me further afield. In university libraries, I unearthed obscure geological reports from the 1960s describing anomalies in the region. Compass needles misbehaving, surveying instruments producing inconsistent readings, unexplained difficulties in measuring altitude. The reports were clinical, devoid of speculation, but their pattern was unmistakable. Scientists had encountered something inexplicable and chosen silence over controversy. But I could not remain silent. Each discovery drew me closer to an unsettling realization. The tremors of gravity were not accidents, not random stutters in the machinery of nature. They seemed to cluster, recur, ripple outward. What if gravity itself was not a stable law but a fragile agreement, occasionally breaking down under circumstances we did not yet understand? The more I considered it, the more terrifying it became. Gravity is not a distant star we can ignore. It is the air we breathe, the unseen hand holding oceans in their basins and mountains against the sky. If it falters even slightly, then all of existence reshapes itself. Was this valley a doorway into such instability? A reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not as loyal as we believe? I thought again of the monk's record, the villager's newspaper, the soldier's letter, the astronomer's quiet fear. What if they had all stood at their own valleys, their own trembling places scattered across time and geography? What if humanity has always brushed against the weakness of this force, only to retreat into silence and forgetfulness each time? Perhaps the forgetting is deliberate, a defense mechanism, because to remember too vividly is to live with unbearable dread. One night, unable to sleep, I sat staring at a stone I had brought from the valley. Perfectly round, smooth as if shaped by centuries of tumbling in a river. And yet no river cut through the plateau where I had found it. I placed it on my desk and watched the faint tremor of my lamp's flame reflected in its surface. For a moment, perhaps only imagination, I thought I saw the stone tilt ever so slightly, not rolling but resisting, as if testing its bond to the desk. I blinked, and it was still. But the image rooted itself in my mind. The possibility that even here, outside the valley, the tremor followed me. If so, then the danger was no longer confined. I could not be certain when or where the next loosening would occur. And if gravity chose to betray us again, would it be gentle, fleeting, or catastrophic? That question looped endlessly in my mind as I walked through crowded streets, the ordinariness of daily life now tinted with menace. People moved without hesitation, unaware of the fragile bargain their bodies had struck with the unseen pull beneath them. They carried groceries, hurried across intersections, leaned against stone walls, all with blind faith that the ground would remain their ally. I envied that ignorance, but I could not share it any more. Every motion felt provisional, every step an experiment. I became obsessed with searching for signs. I scoured old seismic reports, weather logs, even flight records, looking for strange anomalies that hinted at disturbances we had overlooked, and I found them. Tiny notations, barely noticed, scattered across decades. A plane suddenly losing altitude without mechanical cause. A meteorological balloon drifting erratically in calm air. animals panicking before dawn on clear nights. Each incident explained away, but together they formed a mosaic of unease. What if these were not random accidents but shadows of something larger? What if gravity's tremors were still with us? Not every century, but perhaps every year, hidden in plain sight. A dog bolting for no reason, a glass slipping from a hand, a moment of inexplicable dizziness. How many of these small accidents could be symptoms of the Earth briefly forgetting its grip? The psychological toll was immense. I found myself hesitating at staircases, gripping handrails too tightly, pausing before stepping off curbs. It wasn't just fear of falling, it was fear of floating, of being abandoned by the very thing I trusted most. At night I dreamed of ceilings tearing away, of cities unravelling into the sky like smoke. Always there was silence in those dreams, a silence deeper than anything I had known, as if sound itself could not find footing when gravity faltered. And yet, with every dream, my determination sharpened. I knew that fear was not the enemy. Forgetting was. Humanity had forgotten too often, bearing these memories under myth and ridicule. If I could trace the patterns, perhaps I could anticipate the next shift. Perhaps we could be prepared. I turned my attention to the stars. If gravity wavered on Earth, surely the heavens would reveal its echo. Astronomical records are meticulous, and in those long charts I began to find faint irregularities, unexplained shifts in planetary observations, subtle displacements of expected paths. Each time, scientists corrected their instruments or blamed atmospheric distortion. But what if those excuses mask something deeper? Could the whole fabric of space ripple briefly when gravity loosens its grip? It was in one such record from the 1970s that I found a haunting line, scribbled in the margin of a young astronomer's notes. For a moment the stars leaned closer, as though curious. He had erased it later, replacing it with a technical correction, but the original words lingered faintly. It was the kind of sentence a scientist writes only when awe momentarily overcomes discipline. It told me I was not alone in sensing the tremor. The thought of not being alone brought me no comfort. It meant others had seen the signs, felt the dread, and still humanity stood defenceless. Because what defence could there be? If the force that holds oceans and mountains can hesitate, then nothing we build can withstand its pause. Our greatest towers, our most intricate machines, even our bones themselves, all are designed for one gravity only. I began to wonder if perhaps that is why civilizations collapse, not always from war or famine, but from moments when the world itself shifts beneath them. Whole cities might have vanished not from invasion, but from a betrayal too unbearable to record plainly. Instead, they left myths of gods lifting them, or of the sky falling, or of days when the ground turned hostile. What if those were not stories at all, but memories translated into symbols because the truth was too vast to name? The possibility gnawed at me. If another tremor came, stronger, longer, would our cities stand, or would we too be reduced to myth? The question lingered in my throat like smoke, impossible to breathe out. I imagined skyscrapers tearing from their foundations, glass shattering mid-air before raining back down like sharp rain. I saw bridges rising in slow arcs before collapsing into rivers, planes tilting without warning, ships rising from the ocean as though held by invisible ropes. The image was so vivid that it felt less like imagination and more like memory. And if civilizations had faced this before, what traces would remain? Perhaps none. Perhaps gravity's betrayal was the great eraser of history, wiping clean entire cultures in minutes. A city does not need fire or war to vanish. It needs only the world itself refusing to hold it down. Dust, stone, bone, all scattered, all broken, until only silence remains. And silence is the hardest thing to interpret centuries later. I found myself poring over archaeological mysteries with new eyes. Sites where layers of habitation ended abruptly, where buildings lay toppled without evidence of conquest. Entire communities erased without cause. Historians speculate endlessly. Disease, famine, migration. But what if, just once, the cause was simpler and more terrifying? The ground itself refused to hold. Could the abandoned steppe cities, the sudden collapses of coastal settlements, the unexplained destruction in deserts and jungles all share a hidden root? The more I thought, the more the pattern appeared possible. Yet I hesitated to speak it aloud. People cling to the security of constants. To suggest that gravity itself is untrustworthy is to strike at the very core of human certainty. Even I felt the weight of my own words pressing inward, threatening to undo me. But there is a fine line between silence that protects and silence that dooms. If we continue to pretend nothing is wrong, would that not leave us more vulnerable when the next tremor comes? It was then that I began searching for living witnesses, not just scattered notes in journals, but people who had seen it themselves and were still alive to speak. It took months, but eventually I found a cluster of reports from the 1980s in South America, high in the Andes. Villagers there had long whispered of a day of floating dust, when soil lifted in tiny grains before falling back, and animals bolted as though chased by invisible predators. Most outsiders dismissed it, but a few anthropologists had recorded fragments of testimony. If anyone still remembered, I had to go. When I arrived in the village, the air itself felt thinner, as though anticipating my question. The people were cautious, wary of strangers prying into old wounds, but one woman, her hair silver and her eyes unyielding, agreed to speak. She had been a girl when it happened. Her memory was sharp, etched by terror. She told me how she watched dust from the fields rising, hanging mid-air in strange, shimmering columns. Birds froze in the sky, their wings frantic but useless. She remembered her mother screaming, clinging to a fence post as if it alone was trustworthy. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Everything crashing back with brutal force. Roof tiles shattered, animals broke their legs, and silence followed so deep that even the insects seemed afraid to return. Her voice shook as she told me this, not from age but from reliving it. She had never told her children. She wanted them to believe the world was safe. But it is not, she whispered. It can change its mind. That sentence carved itself into me. The earth can change its mind. It was not just betrayal, it was choice, as though gravity itself possessed moods. And if that were true, then no calculation, no science, no human plan could ever fully contain the danger. As I left the village, her words followed me like a second shadow. If the earth could change its mind once, what would stop it from changing again? The woman's words pulsed in me with the rhythm of a second heartbeat, louder than my own. As I descended the mountain roads, her voice seemed to echo in the thin Andean air, and I could not silence it. The more I turned it over in my head, the more unbearable it became. Gravity, the one anchor of existence, was no longer a law, but a decision, and decisions can be reversed. I carried that fear with me like a passenger I could not shake. In airports, I studied how passengers walked, how planes rose into the air, trusting that the pull would remain constant. In cities, I stared up at glass towers and wondered how quickly they would crumble if their weight turned against them. Even in the simplest act, pouring a drink, tossing a coin, I caught myself waiting for hesitation, for the subtle betrayal of the unseen force that had once faltered before. But fear alone would not carry me forward. I needed answers, however partial, however fragmentary. I plunged deeper into research, tracing patterns of reported anomalies. Strangely, many clustered around regions where tectonic plates collided, where the Earth's crust was restless. Could gravity's tremors be linked to seismic unrest? Not just metaphorically, but literally. the planet itself adjusting its hold. Yet the anomalies I had seen, the testimonies I had gathered, spoke not of shaking ground, but of stillness, a silence deeper than earthquakes. It was not motion that betrayed gravity, but suspension, hesitation. The paradox left me restless. I turned to the sky again, consulting astrophysicists, though few entertained my questions seriously. Yet hidden between polite dismissals, I sensed an unease they would not admit. Some mentioned gravitational waves, ripples in space-time caused by distant cosmic collisions. These were detectable only with the most sensitive instruments. But what if, in rare circumstances, they brushed against Earth strongly enough to disturb the delicate balance we rely on? Could our brief anomalies be the whispers of cataclysmic events unfolding light years away? If so, then the danger was not only planetary but universal. One night, deep in my reading, I stumbled upon an obscure paper written by a Soviet scientist in the 1960s. He speculated cautiously that Earth might pass through pockets of altered gravity as it moved through space, zones where the very fabric of the cosmos had been warped by ancient events. Most dismissed his theory as fantasy, yet the idea struck me with the weight of inevitability. If space itself holds scars, then perhaps our world occasionally drifts across them, and for a few moments the pull that binds us is no longer whole. That thought poisoned my dreams. I saw the earth floating like a fragile seed through a vast and broken tapestry, brushing against threads that could unravel us at any instant. In those dreams, people floated helplessly, screaming silently as oceans rose in great globes of water before collapsing back into nothingness. The silence of it was worse than any noise, always silence, as though sound itself depended on gravity's loyalty. The more I uncovered, the more I realised how little humanity had prepared for such a possibility. We build defences against war, famine, storms, even asteroids. But against gravity's betrayal, we have no refuge, no shelter, no plan. How could we? It is not an enemy outside us, but the invisible architecture of our lives. To question it is to question the ground itself, and yet I could not let go. I began charting possible cycles, comparing ancient records with modern anomalies. A rough rhythm emerged, not precise, but suggestive. Every few decades, somewhere in the world, whispers of gravity's faltering arose. If that pattern held, then another tremor was not only possible, but imminent. I stared at my charts, heart pounding, wondering if I had just mapped the countdown to our own unmaking. The paper trembled in my hands, though I could not tell if it was from my own nerves or something more insidious. The quiet dread that maybe the floor beneath me was already preparing to betray me. The lines I had drawn across centuries, from monks to soldiers to villagers to scientists, formed not a random scatter, but a pulse. And pulses suggested rhythm. Rhythm suggested inevitability. It was a thought I did not want to face, but returned no matter how I turned away. If gravity faltered in cycles, then somewhere ahead of me lay the next collapse. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps years away, but coming all the same. And if it had erased civilizations before, could our cities withstand it any better? I began to test myself in subtle ways, as if preparing for the impossible. When I poured water, I watched carefully to see if the stream bent strangely. When I walked at night, I felt the weight of each step, measuring it silently, waiting for the hesitation. Sometimes I swore I felt it, a fraction of a moment where my body seemed lighter, where my hand's grip faltered on an object. Was it real, or just the paranoia I had let root too deeply? That question haunted me most, because if it was only imagination, then I was collapsing into obsession. But if it was real, then I was glimpsing the first cracks. I returned to the valley once more, unable to resist its pull. The place was as silent as before, yet it seemed to recognise me as though waiting. I stood in the clearing where the mist had hung, daring myself to breathe slowly, evenly. And then it came again, subtle, but undeniable. A pebble, loosened from a ledge, fell too slowly, hovering a fraction longer than it should have before striking the earth. My skin crawled. I had proof, but I had no comfort. Proof was worse than ignorance, because it meant the cycle was alive. That night I wrote feverishly in my journal, determined not to let this moment vanish into silence as so many others had. I wrote that I had seen gravity hesitate, however briefly, and that it was the most terrifying sight of my life. More terrifying than storms, more terrifying than fire, because it struck at the very root of existence. If gravity falters, nothing else matters. But as I wrote, another thought intruded, darker than the rest. What if I was not the only one watching? What if gravity's hesitation was not just a blind cosmic accident, but a signal, a message? The myths often spoke not just of weightlessness, but of gods, of watchers, of forces beyond comprehension. Could these tremors be the hand of something unseen, a reminder, a warning? The idea sickened me, but I could not dismiss it. I remembered the woman in the Andes saying, "It can change its mind." Change its mind, as if gravity itself possessed intent. If intent exists, then perhaps so does judgment. What if we were not just passengers on a flawed ship, but subjects in an experiment, tested by the very force that holds us? Sleep eluded me, and in the quiet hours I heard a sound I cannot fully explain. It was not a voice, not exactly, but a resonance, low, deep, as if the stones themselves were humming. For a moment I felt lighter, almost floating, and then it vanished. I don't know if it was real or the product of exhaustion, but I know this: it did not feel indifferent, it felt deliberate. And so the question grew sharper, cutting deeper into me with each passing day. What if gravity does not simply falter? What if gravity decides? That thought was the most unbearable of all, because it stripped away the last comfort of randomness. If gravity is flawed, we can hope it is rare, accidental, an imperfection in the clockwork of the universe. But if it decides, then we are no longer living in a neutral world. We are living under judgment, and judgment can return. I could not dismiss the feeling that I was being led toward this realization piece by piece, by forces that wanted me to see. The scattered records, the silenced scientists, the trembling valleys, all were like breadcrumbs pointing to a revelation larger than human comprehension. I told myself it was paranoia, but paranoia does not leave round stones polished smooth where rivers never ran. Paranoia does not suspend mist mid-air or slow a pebble's fall. No, the world itself was revealing its instability, as though whispering that the ground beneath us is only borrowed. In my darker moments, I imagined that Earth itself was a vessel trapped between competing pulls, that perhaps gravity is not a single force, but a negotiation, a fragile treaty between cosmic powers beyond our understanding. Sometimes the treaty holds, sometimes it wavers, and when it wavers, life trembles with it. This thought sent me spiralling back into myth, stories of gods wrestling in the sky, of giants lifting mountains, of days when mortals floated into the heavens. What if these myths were not creative inventions, but translations of the same truth? Ancient people did not have the words for gravity, but they had words for gods, for judgment, for betrayal. Could it be that they too witnessed the same tremors and struggled to describe them? One fragment haunted me most. A Babylonian tablet, cracked and half erased, spoke of a night when the earth's heart loosened and men rose without wings. Archaeologists had dismissed it as allegory, but I could no longer see it that way. It matched too closely with what I had found, too closely with what I had seen. If gravity decides, then what does it decide for? To remind us of fragility, to erase what has grown too arrogant, to test whether we can endure uncertainty. The questions multiplied endlessly, and no answer satisfied me. Because behind every possible explanation was the same terror: intent. It was around this time that I began noticing subtle shifts even in my own body. Sometimes when I stood quickly, the rush of blood felt heavier than it should have, pulling me down sharply. Other times, it felt the opposite, a dizzying lightness, as though the air had hollowed out beneath me. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue, but each time I remembered the testimonies: children saying the ground pushed them upward, soldiers describing sudden changes in their weight. Could the tremors be intensifying, drawing closer? Then came the night that shattered the last of my doubts. I was sitting by the window staring at the stars when suddenly my glass of water rippled. Not from sound, not from motion, but from something else. The surface tilted, slanting toward the sky as if the pull had changed direction. It lasted only seconds, but in those seconds the silence was absolute. My breath caught, and I realized I could hear nothing. No hum of appliances, no whisper of wind, not even the blood rushing in my ears. Silence deeper than silence, as though the world itself had been paused. Then, with a jolt, everything returned. The water splashed against the rim, sound flooded back, and I stumbled to the floor, gasping. I sat there in the dark for hours, trembling. This was no myth, no forgotten story from the past. It was here, now, intruding into my own life. The cycle had reached me, and perhaps it was reaching all of us. And if this was only the beginning, then what would the next tremor bring? That question followed me into every waking hour, curling around the edges of even the simplest actions. Eating, walking, breathing, all felt provisional now, as though they were rehearsals for something greater, something far more dangerous. I could not shake the certainty that what I had witnessed was not an isolated flicker, but a prelude, a whisper before the roar. I found myself returning obsessively to the testimonies I had gathered, reading them not as scattered curiosities but as prophecy. The monk's trembling words, the villager's panic, the soldier's confession, the woman's whisper in the Andes. Each account carried the same rhythm, the same sequence: silence, hesitation, collapse. If these were echoes of the same phenomenon, then perhaps they also carried a pattern of escalation. A pebble here, a mist there, dust in the fields, water bending upward. Small rehearsals for a day when nothing would be spared. The thought clawed at me. What if these tremors were preparing for something final, a culmination? My mind, already stretched thin, began to fracture along dangerous lines. I no longer trusted the floor beneath me nor the sky above. Sometimes, standing in a crowded street, I felt the vertigo of being an actor, on a stage whose supports were about to vanish. I watched the faces of strangers, and wondered if any of them felt it too. The faint loosening, the invisible hesitation. It became more than fear. It became grief. Because if the next tremor was stronger, it would not just be an event, it would be an erasure. All we have built, towers of steel, songs carved into stone, the fragile architectures of memory and meaning, could be swept away in minutes, and history would not preserve us any more faithfully than it had preserved those lost before. We could become another forgotten myth, another puzzle for some future people to misunderstand. The thought hollowed me. In that hollowness, something else grew, a sense of betrayal deeper than logic. Gravity had been the one force I never doubted, the companion that held me when everything else failed. To lose that trust was like losing the ground of the soul itself. It was not merely terror, it was heartbreak. I felt abandoned, as if a lifelong friend had revealed indifference. How could I stand upon the earth when I knew it might at any moment withdraw its hand? And yet, there was an intimacy in that betrayal, as though the world itself was finally honest, showing us its raw, unstable truth. We had built myths of permanence, of order, of laws that never fail. But what if those were illusions? Perhaps the real story of existence is one of constant negotiation, where even the greatest forces are fickle. And if so, then what does that make us? Fragile beings clinging to a temporary tether? Or witnesses to something larger than fear, something that forces us to confront the true scale of our dependence? One evening, overwhelmed, I walked out into a field. The stars glimmered coldly above, indifferent. I lay on the grass and pressed my body against the earth, feeling its pull, waiting for it to falter. Minutes passed, hours perhaps, and though nothing happened, the anticipation was unbearable. I realised then that the terror was not only in the event itself, but in the waiting, the unending question of when. A tremor could arrive at any second, shattering life without warning. Living under that shadow was itself a kind of collapse, an erosion of certainty that no human spirit was built to endure. And so I asked myself, trembling under the indifferent stars, if this is only the beginning, how much more can the human heart bear before it breaks? That question gnawed at me long after I whispered it into the cold night air. For days afterward, I walked through the world carrying the weight of inevitability, feeling as though my heart was already cracking under pressure it was never built to endure. Yet strangely, amid the fear, I also felt a new kind of clarity. It was as if the certainty of collapse had stripped away all illusions, leaving only the raw truth. We exist because gravity allows us to, and when it hesitates, so do we. I began to study not only the physical evidence of past anomalies, but the psychological scars they must have left behind. What would it do to a child to see the world betray its own rules? What does it do to a village to survive such a moment, knowing it could happen again? The woman in the Andes had confessed she never told her children, sparing them the unbearable knowledge. The old man in the Carpathians had whispered of stones that forget the ground. Yet he had lived decades with that image carved into his memory. These survivors carried a hidden burden, the knowledge that trust in the earth was fragile. And then I realised something chilling. Maybe those who witnessed gravity's betrayal were the ones who never fully recovered, who passed on their unease through myth and legend. Perhaps this was why so many ancient stories carried themes of sky and earth unravelling, not inventions but inheritances, generational echoes of trauma too vast to name. I thought of my own sleepless nights, of staring at water and waiting for it to tilt, of pressing my body against the earth in anticipation of abandonment. Was I too becoming one of them, a carrier of a burden the next generation might inherit in whispers and symbols? If so, what responsibility did I bear? To warn them or to protect them from knowing? The thought broke me open. For the first time, my obsession was not about knowledge, not about proof. It was about love, for the fragile, ordinary lives that might be shattered by truths they never asked to face. Children laughing in playgrounds, lovers walking hand in hand, families gathered at tables, all trusting the ground without question. To speak the truth aloud would steal that innocence, and yet to remain silent might doom them unprepared. The conflict was unbearable. I tried to escape it by seeking solace in history. I revisited accounts of collapses, not just physical but cultural, cities abandoned, civilizations lost, eras swallowed in silence. I asked myself whether those collapses had begun with betrayal not from men, but from the world itself. The more I searched, the more plausible it seemed. Not every ruin is the work of war. Some are the work of silence, of ground that falters, of trust erased. And yet, there was another possibility, one that terrified me even more. What if the tremors were not accidents, not punishments, not tests, but invitations? A door opening, however, briefly to another reality where weight and silence shift. What if those who vanished did not die but were taken? Perhaps into the sky, perhaps into the depths, perhaps into some other realm altogether. Could this explain why myths often speak of chosen ones lifted, of ascents into the heavens, of lands swallowed whole. Not extinction, but transition. I recoiled from the thought, but it stayed, because in every tremor there is both terror and awe. To lose gravity is to lose home, but it is also to glimpse something beyond our comprehension. And perhaps, though my heart resisted the idea, perhaps gravity is not only a force but a threshold. That night I lay awake again, waiting. My breath felt heavy, my body pressed into the mattress as though the earth was reminding me of its claim. And still I whispered the question, if this is only the beginning, what lies beyond the breaking of the heart? The question lingered in me like a wound, unhealed and raw. It was no longer about science or history. It had become deeply personal. To imagine the breaking of the heart was to imagine not just terror, but surrender, the giving up of everything we cling to as stable. And yet part of me wondered if that surrender was exactly what the tremors demanded. I thought of the silence that came with each anomaly, how survivors described it as thicker than air, deeper than emptiness. Perhaps that silence was not absence, but invitation, a space where the world waits for us to let go. When the water tilted in my glass, when the pebble hesitated before falling, when mist froze above the valley, each time silence came with it, as if the earth were asking us to listen. But listen to what? To the claps of trust, or to something greater beyond it? I found myself wandering into churches, temples, even abandoned shrines. Not for faith as people usually mean it, but for echoes. These places held centuries of human attempts to grapple with forces beyond control. Candles burned for gods, prayers whispered for stability, sacrifices made to keep the ground firm. Were those rituals primitive superstition, or the remnants of knowledge we have since forgotten? If civilizations before us knew of gravity's betrayal, perhaps they dressed it in religious language as a way to endure it. To worship what they feared was to survive knowing it could return. The thought unsettled me more deeply than any myth, because it meant we are not the first to kneel before the uncertainty of the ground. We are not the first to whisper into silence, hoping the earth will spare us. We are part of a lineage of fear stretching across millennia, disguised in stories of gods and monsters, but rooted always in the same betrayal. The air too heavy, or too light, or too still. As I sat in one ruined chapel, light spilling through a broken window, I realised that my fear had changed shape. It was no longer only dread of destruction. It had become grief for all those who had carried this burden before me, those whose voices were erased into myth, whose warnings had been forgotten. It was as though I could feel their presence in that silence, as though every tremor stitched our hearts together across time. And in that grief, another possibility flickered. Perhaps the breaking of the heart is not only loss but transformation. If the earth loosens its hold and we fall, or rise, perhaps it is not an end but a crossing. Perhaps gravity's decision is not betrayal, but release. The thought was unbearable, and yet strangely comforting. Could it be that what we call catastrophe is something else in disguise? Still my rational mind resisted. Release for whom? For all? Or only for some? The woman in the Andes spoke of dust hanging, of birds frozen, of animals breaking bones when the pull returned. There was no gentleness in her memory, no grace in the collapse. If release was the intent, it was merciless. And yet, was it truly worse than war, famine, or fire? At least here the destroyer was not human malice, but the shifting of the cosmos itself. These thoughts consumed me until I could no longer separate my life from my obsession. Friends drifted away, unable to understand why I stared so long at nothing, why my words were filled with silence and weight. I had become an echo of the very myths I studied, haunted and hollow. But I could not let go. The world itself demanded I listen. And so I whispered again, to the air, to the silence, to the weight that held me down. If this is the beginning, what comes after the breaking? Is it ruin or revelation? The words burned in me, circling without rest, as if they themselves were suspended in the strange gravity I studied. For days I could not answer, for each possibility carried its own unbearable weight. Ruin meant the end of everything we know. Cities shattered, bodies broken, silence left to reign. Revelation meant something else entirely, something more dangerous to the mind. That what we call reality is only one version, and that gravity, when it shifts, is not destruction, but invitation. I began to see the world differently, not as fixed, but as trembling, quivering with hidden possibility. Every tree, every building, every face I passed seemed precarious, as though they belonged to a fragile arrangement that might be redrawn at any instant. When wind brushed my skin, I felt not just air but the edge of something larger, a presence that might loosen its grip without warning. To live like this was agony, but also awakening. It was as though the veil of certainty had been torn and I could no longer return to blindness. And yet, my heart longed for blindness. I envied the laughter of children who trusted swings to fall back, the confidence of builders stacking bricks higher and higher, the calm of lovers leaning against one another without imagining the ground could betray them. To live without this knowledge was paradise. To live with it was exile. Still, I could not turn away. My search drew me deeper into forgotten histories. I found fragments of texts that spoke of days when the sky held us and the nights of the broken weight. Some were dismissed as metaphor for famine or plague, but I read them now with new eyes. A Greek fragment described men fastening themselves to the earth with ropes, while women sang to the soil to persuade it not to abandon them. A Mayan glyph told of a night when mountains swayed and rivers climbed, and afterward the people left their city, never to return. How many such stories were there, scattered and disguised, fragments of a truth too vast to bear. One passage in particular struck me. It came from a medieval chronicle, speaking of a great pause when the stones forgot their duty. The chronicler wrote, "We prayed not for mercy, but for weight." That line pierced me. Prayed not for mercy, but for weight. They had lived through the betrayal I feared, and they understood that nothing was more sacred than the ground itself remembering its task. The more I read, the more I felt myself unravelling. My body walked in the present, but my mind drifted across centuries, tangled with the voices of those who had stood where I stood, staring into silence. I no longer felt alone, but that was not comfort. It was doom shared across time, a lineage of dread. And still, the central question gnawed at me. Ruin or revelation? If gravity shifts, does it only destroy, or does it show us what lies beyond? The thought of revelation was almost worse than ruin, because revelation meant we had been living in ignorance all along, shielded by gravity's constancy, blind to truths that might shatter our understanding of existence. To face that would be to face madness. One night, tormented by these thoughts, I dreamt of the valley again. But in the dream, I did not watch mist hesitate or pebbles falter. I watched people. They rose slowly from the ground, arms outstretched, not screaming but silent, as though some deeper call pulled them upward. Their faces were serene, even as their bodies left the earth. It was not terror I saw, but surrender. And then, as the pull snapped back, some fell, breaking against the soil, while others did not return at all. They vanished into the sky, leaving only silence behind. I woke with tears on my face, unsure whether they were born of grief or longing, perhaps both. For in that dream I saw both ruin and revelation entwined, destruction for some, release for others, and I wondered, when the next tremor comes, which fate will claim us? The question echoed like a drumbeat in my skull, steady, unrelenting. It was no longer abstract speculation, but a looming certainty. Something was building. I could feel it in the silence between heartbeats, in the unease of animals on quiet nights, in the way the stars seemed to tilt ever so slightly when I stared too long. The tremor was not a distant possibility. It was a horizon, and I was walking toward it. I remember the night when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The city outside my window was calm, but beneath that calm I felt it, an anticipation, as though every brick, every leaf, every drop of water was waiting. I rose from my desk, the chart spread out before me, and pressed my hand against the wall. For a heartbeat it felt wrong. Not lighter, not heavier, just wrong, as if the bond between my flesh and the stone had loosened. Then it happened. The glass of water on my desk rose, tilting upward without spilling, as though invisible hands cupped it from below. My papers rustled, though no wind stirred, and then silence fell, the silence that others had described, the silence that had haunted my dreams. I could hear nothing, not the hum of lights, not the ticking of the clock, not even my own breath. The world was mute, and then my body lifted. It was not sudden, not violent. My feet rose an inch, then two, the floor slipping away as if I were being unfastened from the earth. Terror surged through me, but with it came something else. Awe. The ground was gone, and yet I was still here, suspended in a stillness so complete it felt holy. My arms floated upward as though answering a call, and for a moment I understood why ancient people spoke of gods. But awe shattered quickly into panic. My body jerked, spinning slightly, and I realized I had no control. The air itself held me, and I could not trust it. My papers lifted around me, drifting like pale leaves, my glass shattering silently as fragments spun in slow arcs. I opened my mouth to scream, but even sound betrayed me. My voice did not exist in that silence. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pull returned. I crashed to the ground with brutal force, the air exploding back into sound. Glass shards clinked, paper slapped against the desk, my lungs heaved in ragged sobs. My head struck the floor, and for a moment I saw nothing but darkness. When my vision cleared, I lay trembling, my body bruised but intact. The silence was gone. Gravity had returned. I did not move for hours. The terror was overwhelming, but beneath it pulsed a deeper horror. I had been right. The tremor was not myth, not imagination. It was real, and it had come to me. When I finally staggered to my feet, I saw the room transformed. Objects lay scattered in strange positions, as though tossed by invisible tides. My charts had fallen, but one line remained visible, scrawled in my own frantic hand. It will happen again. The words chilled me, because now I knew the truth. The tremor had not been a culmination. It had been a beginning, a warning, and if I had been chosen to witness it, what else was I chosen for? The thought rattled through me with a weight heavier than the fall itself. Until then, I had been an observer, a seeker of patterns, a collector of forgotten fragments. But now the phenomenon had entered my own room, my own body. It was no longer a matter of study. It was personal. It was intimate. And with that intimacy came a suspicion I could not banish. Perhaps the tremor was not random at all. Perhaps it was deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that I had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment, nothing more. But my mind refused the comfort of chance. It replayed every second, the glass rising, the silence closing in, the way my voice vanished before it reached the air. Those were not accidents. They were experiences crafted to be felt as if the universe itself wanted me to understand, wanted me to know. But why me? I am no prophet, no leader, no scientist of renown. Just a voice chasing whispers in the dark. And yet perhaps that was exactly why. Those who hold power cling to certainty, to appearances of stability. But someone already half broken by obsession, already wandering at the edges of sanity, perhaps I was the perfect witness. A vessel cracked open enough to hold the unbearable. The following nights were unbearable. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every shift of air felt like a warning. Sleep eluded me, not only because of fear, but because of anticipation. I found myself longing for the silence to return, for the weightlessness to claim me again, even as I dreaded it. It was addiction and terror braided together. The betrayal of gravity had become the rhythm of my life. I withdrew further from the world. Conversations felt absurd, as though people were speaking in dreams. How could I talk of weather, of work, of trivialities, when I had floated in the void of silence? How could I laugh with friends when my body still ached from being slammed against the earth by the return of weight? I stopped trying. I carried the secret alone. And yet, isolation gave me clarity. I began to notice subtle signs that I had overlooked before. Small hesitations in falling leaves, the peculiar way dust lingered in sunbeams longer than it should, the faint pause before a coin struck the table. These moments were fleeting, almost imperceptible, but to my eyes, sharpened by dread, they were undeniable. The tremors were not confined to valleys or mountains. They were everywhere, scattered like whispers across the world. One evening I stepped outside, desperate for air, and watched the sky. A flock of birds passed overhead, wings moving in unison, and then, for the briefest instant, they faltered. Their formation broke, bodies lifting unevenly, as if pulled in conflicting directions. They recovered quickly, but the silence in that moment was unmistakable. The same silence. I felt it in my bones. The realization struck like lightning. I was not the only one chosen. The tremor was no longer an isolated visitation. It was expanding, brushing against the edges of daily life, touching countless others who might never admit what they felt. Perhaps some dismissed it as dizziness, or chance, or dreams. But deep inside, they knew, and soon denial would not be possible. That thought should have terrified me, and it did. But it also brought a grim kind of solace. If the tremors were spreading, then I was not alone. A hidden community existed across the world. Witnesses who had felt the earth's betrayal, who carried the same unbearable knowledge. We were scattered, unnamed, but bound by silence and dread. And perhaps when the next great tremor came, we would be the only ones who would not be surprised. Still, the question gnawed at me. Chosen for what? To warn others? To record the unthinkable? Or to be carried somewhere beyond when gravity made its final decision? The possibility unsettled me more deeply than the tremor itself. Destruction I could imagine. Buildings collapsing, oceans rising, bodies broken. But being carried away. That was something else entirely. Not ruin, but transition. A shift not of stones and rivers, but of existence itself. For days, I could not rid myself of the dream I'd had earlier, of people rising into the sky, faces serene as if answering a call, some returning violently to the earth, others never seen again. Was that dream only a trick of my frightened mind, or was it memory, not mine, but inherited through the whispers of those who had witnessed it before? The thought gnawed at me until sleep itself felt like trespass into forbidden knowledge. I tried to push back with logic, drowning myself in physics texts, in theories of relativity and gravitational waves. But the more I read, the thinner the shield became. Science spoke in certainties, in laws that held true across the cosmos. Yet my own body had defied those laws. I had lifted from the ground without wings, without machines. What use was theory when experience had already broken it? And worse, if gravity could decide, then what was it deciding between? Which bodies to release, which to crush? Was it random, or chosen. The testimonies hinted at both. Some people lifted, others pinned down. Some animals escaped unscathed, others shattered by the return of weight. That unevenness terrified me more than any universal collapse, because it meant the force was selective, and selection always implies judgment. I found myself staring at strangers differently, watching their steps, their laughter, their gestures. Who among them would be lifted, and who would be cast down? Would serenity belong to the chosen, while terror claimed the rest? The thought hollowed me, turning every crowd into a quiet rehearsal for a division none of us could escape. The silence haunted me most. I could not forget the way the world had gone utterly mute, as though sound itself required gravity to breathe. In that silence, I had felt watched, weighed, measured, as if something beyond the air had entered the room with me, invisible yet undeniable. I remembered the low resonance I once heard in the valley, the hum that was not a voice but felt like one. What if that silence was not absence but presence? What if the tremor is the moment the world listens back? These thoughts grew unbearable until one night, desperate, I returned to the valley again. It drew me like a magnet, as though answers lay only in that hollow where mist once froze. I stood there under the stars, pressing my feet into the soil, daring it to release me again. Nothing happened at first. The air was heavy with ordinary night sounds, insects, wind, the distant cry of an owl. But then the silence came, sudden, absolute. I froze. My breath caught in my chest and the air thickened. The grass bent without wind, the stream seemed to hesitate, its ripples pausing in their flow. I felt my body lighten, the familiar pull loosening, and once again I was suspended. This time, though, I was not afraid. I opened my arms and let the stillness take me. The valley held me above the ground, weightless, trembling not with terror but with strange calm. And in that silence, I felt it, not words, but meaning, a sense that I was not just witnessing, but participating, as though gravity was asking me a question without language, a question that reached deeper than thought. Then, just as suddenly, it ended. I crashed to the earth, gasping, the sounds of the night flooding back. My body ached, but my mind burned with one unbearable certainty. It had not been random. It had chosen to show me. That thought echoed louder than the silence itself. My body still ached from the fall, my lungs raw with gasps, but my mind pulsed with the unbearable realization that the tremor was not chance. It was intention. Out of all the people who had walked this valley, out of all the billions on earth, it had chosen me to see. And with that choice came a burden heavier than any weight gravity had ever placed on me before. The question was inevitable. Why? Why me? Why now? I had no answers, only fragments, but they swirled into terrible shapes. Perhaps it was because I had listened, because I had dug through the forgotten voices of monks, villagers, and soldiers, refusing to dismiss them as myth. Perhaps the tremor seeks witnesses, people who will not silence its memory. If so, then I was no longer free. I'd been enlisted into a truth older than humanity itself. I wandered the valley for hours trying to steady my thoughts. Every shadow seemed alive, every stone a reminder that the ground's loyalty was only borrowed. My hand traced the grass, the soil, the stream, all trembling with secrets too vast to hold. At times I almost felt gratitude, as though being chosen meant I'd glimpsed something sacred. But that feeling collapsed quickly into dread, for if it had chosen to show me, it could choose to take me. Back in my room, I found myself unable to function in ordinary life. The world outside, people laughing, cars rushing, neon signs flickering, seemed absurdly fragile. They lived unaware, blind to the fact that their weight, their very grounding, was conditional. I envied them, but I also pitied them. For when the tremor comes again, and it will, their shock will be unbearable. At least I had been warned. But being warned did not feel like safety. It felt like a sentence. The more I thought about it, the more I realised that knowledge itself is a kind of exile. To know the ground can betray you is to lose the simple trust that makes life livable. I could not laugh as they laughed, walk as they walked, sleep as they slept. I was already apart, already marked, and yet I could not stop searching. The silence of the tremor had left a hunger in me, as if it carried not only terror but also an answer just out of reach. I began to wonder if others had been chosen too, survivors who had not only witnessed but been lifted as I had. Were they scattered across the world, hidden in their silence, carrying the same burden? If so, then perhaps the tremor was weaving a network of witnesses across centuries, preparing us for something larger. That thought both comforted and horrified me. Comfort because it meant I was not alone. Horror because it meant we were part of a design too vast to escape. Witnesses are not gathered without purpose, and if we were chosen, then surely a moment would come when that purpose revealed itself. One night, restless beyond measure, I sat with the stone I had brought from the valley. I held it in my palm and whispered aloud, asking why, asking for meaning. The room was quiet. Then, slowly, the stone tilted in my hand, not rolling, not shifting from my fingers, but leaning against an invisible force. My breath caught. It lasted only a second, but the message was clear. It is listening. The weight of that realization crushed me. It was not just that I had seen the tremor had seen me, and now I could no longer pretend I was the seeker. I was the sought. The realization hollowed me out like nothing before. I had spent years chasing whispers of the tremor, tracing its shadow across centuries, convinced I was the one uncovering hidden truths. But all along, it was the opposite. The tremor had been waiting, watching, choosing. And now it had turned its gaze fully upon me. For days afterward, I could feel its attention like a pressure in the air. Every sound seemed sharper, every silence deeper. Sometimes, while walking through the city, I felt the ground beneath me pulse faintly, not in motion, but in intent, as though the earth itself were aware of my steps. At night I dreamed of weightlessness, of silence folding around me like a cloak, of a vast presence that pressed against my skin without ever touching it. I would wake gasping, convinced that the tremor had followed me out of the dream. I began to wonder if the others, the monk, the soldier, the woman in the Andes, had felt this too. Not just the terror of the event, but the lingering awareness of being marked. Maybe that was why so many never spoke, why they left only fragments in journals and whispers in stories. They had not remained silent out of fear of disbelief. They had remained silent because they knew they were being watched. The thought turned my fear into paranoia. Every object became suspect. I would place a coin on a table and watch it for hours, waiting for the faintest lean. I would fill a glass of water and hold my breath, waiting for the tilt. Sometimes I thought I saw it, sometimes not. But always I felt the weight of an unseen presence behind it all. The world had become a message written in gravity, and I was the unwilling reader. And yet, beneath the dread, there was a darker current. Fascination. The silence I had experienced was terrifying, yes, but it was also the most profound moment of my life. For an instant I had been outside the ordinary laws of existence, untethered from the ground, staring into the abyss of what might lie beyond. Part of me longed for it to happen again, even as I trembled at the thought. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of falling but unable to resist the pull of the void. I began to suspect that this was the true danger of being sought. Not death, but seduction. The tremor did not only inspire fear, it offered something else, something humans are powerless to resist. meaning. To be chosen meant to matter in a way that transcended ordinary life. And once you taste that, how can you ever return to the triviality of daily existence? One night, as I lay awake, I felt it again. Not the full tremor, not silence, but a hint. A momentary hesitation in the pull that bound me to the mattress. My body lifted ever so slightly, enough for my breath to falter. I froze, heart hammering, but instead of crashing back, I was lowered gently, almost tenderly, as though being reassured. I could not help but weep, because in that moment I realised something I had not dared to admit. I no longer feared it as much as I desired it, and that desire was the most dangerous revelation of all. Because if the tremor was seeking not just witnesses but willing ones, then perhaps that was the true test, to see who recoils and who surrenders. And I, broken as I was, already knew my answer. To admit it, even silently, was to betray the last remnants of the life I had known. I was no longer only afraid of the tremor, I was bound to it, drawn toward it, as though it were the only truth left worth touching. Fear and longing had fused into something I could not name, and in that fusion I recognized my fate. I would not run, I would not resist. When it came again, I would surrender. This realization changed everything. The world around me no longer felt solid in the way it once had. Streets, buildings, even the faces of people I passed, they all seemed like shadows painted over something greater. It was as though the tremor had peeled away the surface of reality, and now I could glimpse the raw machinery beneath. Every sound was too sharp, every silence too deep. I was no longer living in the same world as those around me. I began to imagine what surrender might mean. Would I rise into the silence, body dissolving into air, vanishing into some place where weight no longer mattered? Would I collapse inward, crushed not by gravity's return but by its absence? Or would I simply drift forever, neither alive nor dead, suspended in the pause between forces? Each possibility terrified me, but none of them felt like punishment. They felt like transformation. It was in this state of half-resigned anticipation that I discovered something that chilled me even more than the tremor itself. In the margins of an old manuscript, one written by a mystic in the 11th century, I found a phrase that seemed to speak directly to me. We were not the first to be lifted, nor will we be the last. Some are chosen to remain, some to be carried, and those who are carried never return, for they have become part of the pull itself. The words froze me. Not the first, not the last. The mystic had known. Perhaps he too had been sought. Perhaps he had felt the same silence, the same suspension, the same unbearable choice. And if he was right, then those who disappeared were not destroyed but absorbed, woven into the very fabric of the force itself. The idea horrified me, yet it also explained something I had felt but could not articulate. In the silence of the tremor, I had sensed not emptiness but presence. Countless presences, layered and intertwined, as though the silence itself was crowded. What if those who vanished had not gone elsewhere, but had become the silence, the watchers, the weight behind the weight? That night, lying awake, I pressed my palms to the floor, whispering questions into the dark. Are you there? Are you listening? Are you the ones who are carried? No answer came in words, but the air thickened, and once again the faintest hesitation in gravity's pull brushed against my body, as if in acknowledgement. I wept, not from terror, but from recognition. And so my resolve hardened. I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as part of a continuum, a lineage of chosen ones marked by the tremor, bound to carry its truth forward until the moment of surrender. My life, fractured as it had become, now felt like a waiting room for something vaster than life itself. The next time silence falls, I will not fight it. I will open myself fully, not as a seeker, but as one sought, not as a victim, but as one chosen. And if I am carried, Then I will finally understand what lies beyond. That promise whispered itself into every thought, every dream, every fragile waking hour. It was no longer simply fear or longing, it was inevitability. I walked through life as though I were already half absent, my feet touching the ground but my soul hovering just above it, waiting for the silence to claim me again. The world around me began to feel less real. Markets, laughter, traffic, the endless rituals of daily survival, all of it seemed like theatre, fragile lines recited on a stage that might at any moment collapse. I wondered how many others carried this same secret, how many had brushed against the tremor and walked onward, unable to speak, unable to share. Perhaps I was not alone after all. Perhaps across the globe there were hundreds, thousands, carrying this same unbearable knowledge in silence, witnesses scattered like hidden constellations, unseen but aligned. At night, I would dream of them, not as individuals but as silhouettes rising against the horizon, faces blurred by light, all lifted by the same invisible hand. Some reached upward willingly, others clawed desperately at the ground, but all were pulled just the same. When I woke, I could almost feel them near me, their presence like a weight in the air. I began to suspect that the chosen were connected, bound not by sight or speech but by gravity itself. Perhaps that was the true meaning of being sought, not isolation, but initiation into a hidden communion of the marked. The thought filled me with equal parts dread and comfort. Comfort because I was no longer entirely alone. Dread because it meant we were being gathered, drawn slowly, inevitably towards something final. If gravity chooses, then its choosing is not random. It is selection, and selection always leads to culmination. I began to notice changes in my perception. Sometimes, when I looked at the stars, I felt they leaned closer, bending toward me as though the fabric of space itself had thinned. Other times, my own shadow seemed heavier, darker, clinging unnaturally to the ground. I would test it, lifting objects, dropping them, waiting for hesitation. More often than not, I found it. A fraction of a pause, a subtle lean, the faintest reminder that the pull was not as steady as it pretended to be. And then came the voices. Not voices in the ordinary sense. No words, no language, but resonances. A hum in the silence, a vibration in the bones. At first I dismissed it as tinnitus, as the imagination of a restless mind. But soon I realised it came only when the pull hesitated, when the world slipped into its hidden rhythm. In those moments, I felt surrounded, as if countless presences hovered just out of sight. Were they the ones who'd been carried before me? Were they reaching back, urging me onward? The possibility chilled me, yet I didn't turn away. I found myself listening for it, yearning for it, as though the hum itself had become my anchor. Ordinary life had already lost its grip on me. My friends had grown distant, my work abandoned, my days consumed by waiting. The tremor had not only marked me, it had rewritten me. And so, standing on the edge of this unbearable threshold, I asked myself, if the next silence comes, will I fight, or will I rise willingly? The answer was already inside me, and it frightened me more than anything. For though my body trembled with fear, my soul leaned toward surrender. The admission felt like treason against life itself. Every instinct in a human body screams to hold on, to grip the ground, to resist the pull of death, to cling to survival. Yet I knew, deep inside, that if the silence returned and the air unfastened me from the earth once more, I would not fight it. I would open myself like a door and let whatever waited beyond step through me. This knowledge shifted how I saw everything. Fear did not vanish, but it was transformed. It became something like reverence, like the way one looks at fire, knowing it can destroy you, but also knowing you are drawn to its glow. Every step I took, every breath, every moment of weight pressing me to the ground became not a given, but a gift. And behind that gift, the reminder that at any moment it could be taken back. I walked through crowds with a strange awareness, imagining how the silence would unravel them. The chatter of voices would vanish mid-sentence. The rush of footsteps would halt in mid-air. The smallest crumbs of bread would hang suspended like planets in orbit. And then, when the pull returned, everything would crash with a violence beyond comprehension. I shuddered at the image, yet also longed for it, as if only in that moment of collapse could the truth be fully revealed. In my solitude, I began speaking aloud to the silence, even when it was not there. I whispered questions into empty rooms, testing whether the air would answer. Sometimes it did, not with words, but with a shift, a subtle hesitation in the weight of my body, the faintest tilt of objects nearby. It was enough to keep me waiting, enough to remind me I was not forgotten. The realization grew in me like a second heartbeat. The tremor was not only a force, it was a presence, and presences choose. I started to wonder if the chosen throughout history had not simply vanished, but become part of that presence. The hum I felt in the silence, the layered vibration, the crowded stillness. Perhaps it was them, the carried ones, merged into the vastness, no longer individuals but facets of a greater whole. If so, then surrender was not destruction, it was communion. But communion with what? With the earth itself? With the cosmos? With something beyond even those? The question gnawed at me, yet I sensed the answer could not be understood from this side. It required crossing, and to cross required surrender. One evening, as I sat in the valley once again, the air shifted in a way I had come to recognise. The silence had not yet fallen, but the world was preparing for it. The stream's sound thinned, the insects grew hesitant, and the stars seemed sharper, closer. My body trembled, my pulse racing, but my soul leaned forward like a man stepping toward a threshold. I whispered into the night, "I am ready." The silence did not come fully, not yet. Instead, the air pressed heavier, almost tender, as though acknowledging my words. I felt both cradled and watched, as if the unseen presence was measuring my willingness. For the first time, I did not collapse in fear. I sat upright, waiting, trembling but unbroken. And in that moment I understood something terrible and beautiful. The tremor was not just a warning of collapse, it was a question. Not will you survive, but will you surrender? And when the silence finally comes again, I know my answer will not be resistance. Those words were no longer just a thought. They became a vow. I carried them in my chest like a hidden inscription, carved into bone, etched into the quiet corners of my mind. Fear still clung to me, yes, but it no longer ruled me. Instead, I felt as though I had crossed some invisible threshold, stepping from the realm of the terrified into that of the willing. The world noticed my change, though no one could name it. Strangers glanced at me with faint unease, as though sensing something off in my gaze. Friends I still saw grew restless in my presence, their conversations stuttering into silence when I lingered too long. They could not feel what I felt, but they sensed it. The air around me charged, the gravity near me somehow less certain. It was as if my surrender had marked me outwardly, even before the silence returned. I began to test the limits of this new awareness. Sometimes I would sit in a crowded cafe, watching spoons tremble on tables, glasses quiver ever so slightly, papers flutter without wind. No one else seemed to notice, but I did. The tremor was with me always now, faint but undeniable, a background hum in the architecture of reality. The silence had not yet come fully, but the world was thinning in places, fraying at its edges, and I could feel it. This gave rise to a terrifying possibility. What if the silence did not strike all at once, but seeped gradually, touching one witness at a time until the entire world was woven into it? If so, then my surrender was not mine alone. It was part of a collective yielding, a slow unfurling across centuries, preparing for a moment when the earth itself would no longer hold. At night, I dreamed of that culmination. Not chaos, not destruction, but a great exhale. The earth sighing as its grip loosened, releasing not just me, not just a few chosen, but everything. Mountains rising like smoke, oceans lifting into vast orbs of water, cities unravelling upward, humanity scattered across the sky like sparks from a fire. In those dreams there was no screaming, only silence, vast and absolute, swallowing everything. And in that silence I felt peace. When I awoke, the peace remained, but so did the grief. For peace would not spare the ones who were unprepared, the ones who had never felt the tremor and never been chosen. For them it would not be revelation. It would be ruin. Children would break, bodies would fall, cities would collapse. And yet, could I warn them? Could I tell anyone what awaited without sounding mad? Even if I did, what good would it do? No shelter can protect against the betrayal of gravity. No wall can hold against the silence. So I carried it alone, letting my vow remain unspoken. To resist would be futile. To surrender was the only path. One evening, I returned again to the valley, as though drawn to the place where it had first shown itself to me. The mist hung heavy, and the stream whispered with unnatural pauses. I stood in the clearing and whispered aloud, "I am ready." The words dissolved into the night, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the silence touched me, not fully, but enough. The ground loosened beneath me. My body rose an inch, and in that instant I felt the presence again. Countless presences layered and humming, the carried ones. They brushed against my mind, and though no words were spoken, I understood surrender is not death. It is joining. And in that moment the grief eased. It didn't vanish, not completely, but it softened, as though the weight of sorrow had been placed into different hands. I realised then that grief was not just mine to carry. It belonged to all who had been touched by the silence, all who had felt the tremors choosing. Perhaps this was why the presence felt so crowded, why the hum within the stillness carried such density. Each one who surrendered had left their grief behind, weaving it into the vastness, where it transformed into something else. I stood in the valley for a long time that night, listening not to sound but to its absence. The air itself seemed alive, each breath carrying me closer to the threshold. I whispered again, not a plea this time, but a promise. I will not resist you. The words hung in the dark, and though nothing visible answered, I felt an acknowledgement ripple through me, subtle and immense. It was as if the silence had nodded. From that night onward I lived differently. The mundane rhythm of existence still pressed around me, meals, conversations, the ticking of clocks. But I drifted through it all as though I were already halfway gone. The silence was not merely something I awaited. It was something I was becoming. This shift brought with it visions, not dreams exactly, not waking hallucinations, but moments where the veil between here and beyond grew thin. I would look at the horizon and see it bend, see the line of the earth curve as if reality itself were bowing toward me. Or I would reach for a cup and feel it resist, hanging between hand and table for an impossible instant before settling into my grasp. In those flashes the tremor whispered, "Not yet, but soon." I began to think of time differently. It was no longer a straight line, but a slow, tightening spiral, leading me inevitably toward the centre point of surrender. Each day wound me closer. Each hesitation in gravity drew me further inward. I no longer wondered if it would happen again. I wondered only when. There were moments, though, when doubt clawed back. Fear would return in sharp stabs, whispering, "What if surrender is annihilation, not communion? What if the carried ones are not joined but destroyed, erased without trace? What if the silence is not a doorway but a trap?" I wrestled with these doubts, but always the hum returned, and in its layered resonance I felt something more than destruction. I felt recognition, memory, even warmth. And so, though the fear never fully left, it no longer defined me. The valley became my pilgrimage site. I returned often, sometimes in daylight, sometimes beneath the constellations. The stream was constant, yet even its constancy carried hints of hesitation, small absences folded within its sound. I would sit cross-legged in the grass, waiting, whispering, surrendering, and each time the silence leaned a little closer, as though testing my readiness. One evening clouds gathered low and heavy. The air pressed thick and the stream fell utterly still. For an instant the silence deepened beyond sound, and I felt the ground release me. My body lifted, not in dream but in reality, rising several inches before being gently returned. When my feet touched earth again, tears burned my eyes. I knew then beyond doubt, it was coming. The tremor had not abandoned me, it was preparing me. And so, when the silence falls again, fully, completely, I will not cling to earth. I will not scream. I will not fight. I will step into it as into water, letting myself be carried where countless others already wait. That thought repeated itself within me like a mantra, threading through my veins, softening the sharpness of fear. I began to imagine surrender not as an end, but as immersion, a slipping beneath the surface of something vaster, deeper, more infinite than life itself. Water was the closest image my mind could conjure, but I sensed even that was only a shadow of the truth. The days that followed carried an unusual calm. I moved through the streets as if walking within two worlds, the ordinary, where children laughed and traffic hummed, and the other, where everything quivered just beneath its surface. I could see both at once, feel them overlapping. Gravity had become a veil, thin and fragile, and behind it loomed the silence, waiting. People around me were unaware, blind to the hairline cracks in reality, but I saw them, and with every passing hour I felt them widening. I began to notice signs in places I had overlooked before. Ancient carvings on stones in the valley showed figures not standing but suspended, arms outstretched, bodies tilted as if weightless. In old manuscripts stored in the library, I found passages that described days when the earth loosened her grip and chosen ones floated into the heavens. The words were cloaked in myth, dismissed as metaphor, but I recognized them instantly. The silence was not new. It had always been here, selecting, carrying, gathering. I was only the latest in a lineage of witnesses. This realization struck me with awe. I was not the first, nor would I be the last. Across centuries, perhaps across millennia, others had surrendered before me, merging with the vast presence. That was why the hum felt so dense, so layered. It was the accumulation of countless surrenders, voices woven together into something beyond voice. If I joined them, my essence would not vanish. It would resonate, adding to the chorus. But another thought unsettled me. Why did the silence choose only a few at a time? Why not all? Why scatter its selections across generations instead of swallowing the world whole? The question gnawed at me, and though I had no answer, I began to suspect the silence was not random but patient. It was building towards something, preparing. At night, lying awake, I would imagine the moment it finally extended its hand fully. Would the world know it? Would every tree, every stone, every body be lifted at once? Would the oceans rise in orbs, the mountains drift upward into the void, cities unravel into constellations? Would the hum of the carried become so vast that it swallowed the stars themselves? The vision filled me with terror, yes, but also a strange joy. If surrender was joining, then perhaps the whole world was destined to join. One evening, as I sat in the valley once more, the silence brushed close. The stream froze mid-sound, the air thickened, and my body rose again, higher this time until my toes barely touched the ground. I did not panic. I closed my eyes, let my arms spread, and whispered, "Take me." But then, just as suddenly, the pull released and I dropped softly back into the grass. It had not carried me, not yet. The denial was not cruelty, it was preparation. I understood then that surrender was not a single act, but a process. Each hesitation in gravity another lesson, each moment of suspension another rehearsal. The silence was shaping me, testing me, ensuring I would not resist when the final release arrived. And so, I wait. Each day, each night, listening for the thinning of sound, feeling for the hesitation of weight. I am no longer afraid. My vow is made. My body belongs to earth, but my soul belongs to the silence. Repeating those words to myself was like breathing a deeper kind of air, an air that reached into the marrow. I no longer flinched when objects quivered on shelves, or when the weight of my own footsteps seemed uncertain beneath me. Instead, I leaned toward those moments, embracing them as affirmations that the silence was near, that I had not been forgotten. Yet with this acceptance came a sharper clarity. The silence was not simply waiting to claim me, it was reshaping me. Each encounter had hollowed out old fears, each brush with weightlessness had stripped away attachments. I realized I had begun to see my fellow humans differently. Their laughter, their frantic movements, their stubborn insistence on stability seemed almost fragile, like children building castles of sand at the edge of an incoming tide. They could not sense what I did, or perhaps they refused to. It made me wonder, had others among them been chosen and hidden it, as I had? Were there strangers in the crowd, walking with the same strange awareness, carrying the same vow? I searched faces in marketplaces, in train stations, in crowded streets, looking for eyes that mirrored my own. Once or twice, I thought I caught it. A gaze too still, a posture too knowing. But before I could approach, the crowd would carry them away, leaving me uncertain whether it was truth or projection. The silence remained my only certainty, and with each visit its presence deepened. No longer just pauses in sound, no longer mere hesitations of weight, but something vast pressing through the seams of reality itself. Sometimes it came in dreams, but not my own dreams. These were shared, visions not born of my mind, but placed within it. I saw endless plains where bodies floated in luminous stillness, eyes closed, faces serene. They were not corpses, they were waiting, suspended in an eternal moment between falling and rising, carried not upward or downward, but outward, towards something too large to name. When I woke from such visions, I carried their silence with me. It would follow me for hours, bending sound, thickening air, until the ordinary world seemed thin and unreal. And in those hours I felt closer to them, the others, the carried ones. Their presence was not distant but intertwined with mine, as though surrender blurred the lines between identities. If that was the truth, then perhaps joining them would not erase me but multiply me. Still, one question clawed at the edges of my surrender. Why me? Why any of us? The presence never explained. It only pressed, waited, chose. Was it seeking strength, obedience, willingness? Or was there some thread of memory, some echo of past lives that linked me to it? At times I thought perhaps it was not choosing us at all. Perhaps it was simply calling, and only those who listened could hear. One night, Under a sky heavy with stars, I stood in the valley once more. The stream was silent, not even a ripple breaking its mirrored surface. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest, and I felt the ground release me again. This time I rose higher, my feet fully leaving the earth, my body suspended in the stillness. My heart thundered, yet I didn't resist. I spread my arms wide, whispering, "I am yours." And then it held me there, not carried away, not dropped back, but held. For what felt like eternity, I hovered between earth and sky, cradled in the invisible hands of the silence. My tears rose with me, drifting from my cheeks as spheres of water. My body quivered with awe, with surrender, with the recognition that I was no longer entirely of earth. Something had shifted, something had claimed me. When at last the pull released and I sank back into the grass, I was trembling, not with fear, but with certainty. My vow had been accepted. I belonged to it now, fully. The words did not feel like a thought, but like a verdict, something inscribed upon me by the silence itself. From that moment onward, the world lost its solidity. Not vanished, not yet, but softened, blurred at the edges, as though the fabric of reality had grown threadbare. Streets seemed longer, sky wider, time less tethered. The ordinary no longer felt like home. It was a place I wandered through as a guest. I noticed that people around me began to sense something different. They would pause mid-sentence when speaking to me, as if their tongues forgot what they had meant to say. Children stared longer, their eyes wide with a recognition they could not articulate. Even animals reacted strangely. Birds sometimes circled lower overhead, as though following a hidden current around me, and dogs would fall silent in my presence, watching with still, alert eyes. None of them understood, but all of them knew. It was then I realized the silence had not merely chosen me, it was marking me. The hum was no longer only inside my ears, but inside my very skin, a low vibration that coursed with every heartbeat. In moments of stillness, I would lay my palm upon my chest and feel it there, steady, unyielding, not unlike a second pulse. This resonance was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it told me I was no longer alone. Terrifying because it told me I was no longer only myself. And then came the dreams, or perhaps visions, or perhaps memories that were not mine. I saw a time when the earth was younger, when oceans stretched without borders and skies were raw and unshaped. In that time there were others who walked as I did, already marked, already trembling on the edge of surrender. I saw them rise slowly, gracefully, their faces serene, their bodies dissolving not into dust but into light. They did not vanish. They became part of the silence itself. When I awoke from these visions, my hands shook. The silence had shown me not only what was possible but what was inevitable. To resist now would be to deny the very shape of my existence. And yet, deep within me, a question pressed sharp. If they all dissolved into silence, why had none returned? Was joining emerging, or was it an end disguised in beauty? That question haunted me. I walked the streets by day and the valley by night, asking it silently with every step. Sometimes, faintly, I thought I heard an answer, not in words, but in the thickening of air, in the bending of sound. The answer was not no, nor was it yes. It was simply, come and see. One evening, beneath a sky streaked with red, I felt the silence descend heavier than it ever had before. The stream froze, the grass bowed, the stars above flickered as if dimmed by its presence. And then I was lifted, higher this time than ever before. My body rose fully into the air, my arms spread wide, my chest burning with the vibration. I hovered there, between earth and sky, no longer tethered by either. The hum filled me until I could hardly breathe. Tears broke from my eyes, not of fear, but of awe. For in that moment I understood the silence was not only an ending, not only a carrying away, it was a promise, a gathering. a convergence that stretched beyond history, beyond memory. I was not simply chosen. I was being woven into something vast and eternal. As the pull slowly released and I descended once more, my legs trembled beneath me. I knew then that the final surrender was near. The silence had tested me, shaped me, marked me, and now it was calling me to step fully into what I was meant to become. That realization weighed on me more heavily than gravity ever had, because it was not just a summons, it was an ultimatum. There was no turning back, no retreat into the old world of certainty. The ground I had once trusted was no longer mine, and the air I breathed now belonged to something else. The following days felt dreamlike. I walked through the city streets, past familiar buildings and faces, yet they no longer seemed permanent. The laughter of children, the shouts of merchants, the lights and windows, all appeared fragile, like paint on the surface of glass that could be wiped away in a single breath. Beneath it, the silence pulsed, waiting, steady and unshakable. I began to realize something unsettling. It wasn't only claiming me. Subtle shifts were rippling through the world itself. Birds flew at odd angles, wings catching air that no longer flowed the same way. Rivers hesitated mid-current, as though their own weight was uncertain. Once I saw a man on the street stumble, when his own footsteps seemed lighter than expected, his eyes wide with confusion. The silence was no longer whispering, it was extending its reach. That was when the truth struck me like a thunderclap. I had never been the end goal. I was not the destination but the bridge. The silence had marked me, yes, but not just for my sake. It was using me as an anchor, a conduit, a point through which it could flow more fully into the world. Its patience, its scattered selections through history, had always been moving toward this moment. Not a handful of chosen ones, but a collective surrender. The visions returned, fiercer now. I no longer saw isolated souls rising into stillness. I saw entire landscapes shifting, forests trembling in mid-air, oceans rising as shimmering walls of suspended water, cities unravelling into luminous threads. It was not destruction, it was transformation. Everything was being gathered, carried, woven into the silence. And at the centre of it, I saw myself, not as a figure but as a spark, a node in a vast web of resonance stretching across the cosmos. It was then that I understood the silence had never been absence. It was fullness beyond comprehension. What I had called silence was not the lack of sound, but the presence of all things harmonized into a single note. Every life, every thought, every star and stone, fused, sustained, and held together. To surrender was not to vanish, but to return, to belong. Yet a final twist unsettled me, even as awe consumed me. The silence had not left us clues to follow. The carvings, the myths, the fragments I had unearthed. They were not messages of guidance. They were warnings. Every figure lifted from the earth, every myth of floating bodies, every whispered tale of sudden disappearances, they were attempts, across ages, to tell us what awaited. Not to comfort us, but to caution us. And still, here I stood, marked and ready. My fear had been hollowed out long ago. Even the warnings could not dissuade me, because the silence was no longer something outside of me. It had already threaded itself into my breath, my blood, my bones. I was not waiting for it to come. It was already here. That night, as stars shimmered above the valley and the stream froze once more into stillness, I lifted my arms and whispered, "I am ready." The silence surged, embracing me not as a visitor but as one of its own. The air folded, the ground fell away, and I rose. Not in terror, not in resistance, but in recognition. The final surrender had begun. Those words echoed through me, not as a phrase I had spoken, but as a truth reverberating from every corner of the universe. I felt the weight of my body dissolve, yet not as disintegration, more like the shedding of something no longer needed. My skin no longer marked a boundary. My breath was not confined to lungs. My eyes, though closed, saw farther than horizons. As I hovered there, I realised that surrender was not a single act. It unfolded in layers, each stripping away another illusion of separation. First, the body. I felt the weight of muscle, bone and blood fall away as if it were clothing, laid gently aside. Then, the mind. Thoughts I once believed were mine scattered into the vastness, merging with currents of countless other voices. But instead of losing myself, I felt expanded, connected, multiplied. Fear no longer existed. What I once mistook as dread had transformed into recognition. The silence was not erasing me. It was widening me, extending me beyond the narrow vessel of flesh and memory. For the first time, I sensed what it meant to exist without edges. Time bent with me. Moments no longer lined up in sequence. I could feel the first time I had ever looked at the valley, the moment I was born, the instant of my death yet to come, all overlapping, all equally present. It was not chaos but harmony, a symphony of existence where every note played at once yet nothing was lost. And then came the convergence. I felt them, the others, not visions, not echoes, but the true presence of those who had surrendered before me. Their essence folded into mine, or perhaps mine folded into theirs. Thousands, millions, maybe more, each one distinct, yet none separate. I was not alone, and I had never been. The realization broke me with awe. Humanity's story was not written only in stone, soil, or memory. It was written here, in the silence, preserved not as fragments, but as whole beings absorbed into something eternal. Every civilization that had risen and fallen, every vanished city, every unmarked grave, none were gone. They were here, waiting. And now I was among them. But even in this vastness, one truth unsettled me. The silence had no intention of returning us. It was not preservation for the sake of reawakening. It was preservation for the sake of belonging. The world I had left, the people I once loved, the soil I once walked, they would continue their brief dance until their turn came, and then they too would be gathered. What startled me most was that the silence was not hungry, not cruel, not even deliberate in the way we understand choice. It was inevitable. Like gravity itself, it pulled not out of malice, but out of law, out of nature. To resist it was as meaningless as resisting breath. To surrender was to step into the current that had always been flowing. From the height of this understanding, I gazed down upon the earth, blue, fragile, trembling in the grip of forces it could never see. Cities flickered with light, rivers bent in their ancient paths, mountains rose into night. And for the first time I felt no separation between the earth and myself. I was not watching it. I was it. The silence did not speak, but I understood its message as clearly as if it had been carved into my bones. This was never about ending. It was about becoming. Every life, every grain of dust, every star that burns and collapses, all of it destined to gather here, in the stillness beyond sound, in the fullness mistaken for silence. As I drifted deeper into that convergence, one final question lingered in me, not as resistance, but as wonder. If everything returns here, if all we are is absorbed, then what lies beyond even this? What holds the silence itself? That question reverberated through me like a final toll of a hidden bell, a soundless vibration that rippled across the vastness where I now drifted. I had surrendered, and yet even here, even in the heart of convergence, wonder remained. The silence was total, but it was not empty. It was layered, alive, teeming with currents I could not name, and beyond it I sensed something, a shadow behind the infinite, a mystery beyond the ultimate mystery. The thought shook me, not with fear, but with awe. Could it be that even the silence, the force that had gathered civilizations and swallowed stars, was itself part of something larger? Was the silence only one chamber of an endless labyrinth, one note in a song we'd mistaken for the whole? The immensity of it pressed against me, stretching the edges of my new form, daring me to imagine further than I ever had. I felt the presence of the others, millions entwined with me, their voices not as words but as impressions, shared astonishment, shared surrender. Some seemed content, dissolved completely into the stillness. Others, like me, stirred with restless curiosity, asking silently if this was truly all there was. The silence absorbed the questions but offered no answers. Perhaps that was its final lesson. Answers were not gifts to be handed down, but frontiers to be crossed. To wonder was not failure. It was the seed of continuity, the echo of existence itself. Even in surrender, the desire to ask, to reach, to seek did not vanish. It burned quietly like embers under ash. And so I floated in the vastness between contentment and yearning, between dissolution and persistence. I thought of the world I'd left behind, the valley, the river, the people who still walk the earth, unaware of the pull that awaited them. One day, they too would join this convergence. Their laughter, their struggles, their stories, all would be gathered, not lost but folded into the silence. I wondered if, when that day came, they too would ask what lies beyond. Looking down at earth from this boundless height, I felt both a pang of longing and a deep peace. Humanity was fragile, yes, but also magnificent in its questions, in its refusal to be satisfied with the surface of things. We built myths, stories, sciences, machines, all for one purpose: to keep reaching. And perhaps that was the answer. The silence holds us, but what holds the silence? Maybe we do with our questions, with our restless, endless wondering. I dissolved further, becoming less of a self, more of a thread in the infinite weave. Yet I clung gently to that last spark of individuality, enough to send this thought echoing outward to anyone who might someday hear it. Surrender is not the end. Even within the silence, the questions remain, and perhaps they are the truest form of life. And now I turn to you. If the silence is real, if it waits for us all, then what does that mean for the lives we live now? Should we fear the pull or embrace it as our return? If everything is preserved here, what does it mean to be forgotten? And if the silence itself is only part of something greater, then what lies beyond even this? Share your thoughts below. And if you're new here, subscribe to Planet Echoes so you don't miss the next journey into the world's hidden history.